Hi, Facebook friends. Helen Archontou here, CEO of the YWCA of Northern New Jersey. So happy to have some time with you today on this Tuesday. In the world of the YWCA, this week has been dedicated for the Week Without Violence campaign. YWCAs all across the country are doing a series of events to try to uplift this global movement to put an end to violence against women and girls. This year, the theme for this global campaign is Beyond Resilience, from Surviving to Thriving. And for survivors, resilience is central to weathering the mental, physical, and emotional harm of gender-based violence and racism. Due to the immediate and long-term health impacts of surviving violence, true resilience requires replenishment, rest, and recovery. So we've decided this week to dedicate our YWTV platform specifically to raising some awareness around issues of sexual violence. And specifically, this three-part series that we're focused on this week will also focus on some of the sexual violence stories that have been in our news over the last few months. And what we know is sexual violence is happening every day and not always in the news. And all of these cases absolutely deserve to have the respect and the support and the resources to be able to get our survivors to healing. But specifically, what we're going to talk about today is an issue that we have been grappling with here in New Jersey in a very dedicated and committed way over the last, I'd say, 2 years. A very focused group has been looking at sexual assault and sexual violence in our political field. We also know that this has been a conversation that's been in the news very much this year as we've watched the governor of New York step down as a result of allegations that came forward. And but here in New Jersey, we have been, we're fortunate to have our Senator Loretta Weinberg, who has always kept her pulse and her eye on this issue, because again, this is not a new issue. And just because this has been a focus of a group that she's pulled together over this time, what we heard through this effort, and we'll hear more about today, is that there's many stories that have spanned a very long time that fall, and into this area and category that we're talking about today. So with that, I want to start our broadcast today by introducing our guests who can talk in great detail about this work group that came together and their efforts that they have accomplished here in New Jersey, and also the topic as a whole. And so with that, I would like to welcome to YWTV Sabeen Masih, who is Vice President of Public Affairs at Capital Impact Group, a government affairs and business development firm in Trenton. Sabeen's policy expertise ranges from healthcare to animal welfare and alcohol and cannabis regulatory issues, representing a variety of clients, including Progressive Insurance, Girl Scouts of New Jersey, and the Wine Institute. She co-founded a growing group, Asian Women of Trenton Networking Group, an organization dedicated to connecting and increasing the number of women of Asian descent who are politically engaged throughout the state of New Jersey. She is also a member of the Eagleton Alumni Committee, the Bipartisan Coalition for Women's Appointments, and Senator Weinberg's working group on harassment, sexual assault, and misogyny in New Jersey politics, which was what we're going to talk about today. I also would like to welcome Julie Roginsky. She is the founding partner of Comprehensive Communications Group and has 2 decades of public and private sector experience as an advisor on strategic communications, political strategy, and public relations. Her expertise is grounded in her work on behalf of corporate and political clients. She has advised Fortune 500 companies, startups, nonprofits, and dozens of elected officials, including our New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, Senators Cory Booker and Frank Lautenberg, members of the House of Representatives, and our state legislators. She is also the co-founder of Lift Our Voices, a national organization dedicated to transforming the American workplace. She is a former contributor at Fox News Channel, where she was a frequent co-host of Outnumbered and The Five, and prior to that, she was a contributor to CNBC. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to being here.
So I had the opportunity to testify in front of the work group and hear, as I said, decades and decades of stories of women that were young, early in their careers of politics, women who had been working in the political field for many years, sharing story after story about toxic culture and sexual harassment in New Jersey politics. And we also know that this is not an issue that is gender-based. Quite frankly, sexual violence is an issue that impacts everyone. But can we start by talking a little bit about the work group that was pulled together and why it was pulled together?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this and bringing attention to not just our work, but to these issues, which are so important. And when I started out, 25 years ago now, I have to say we'd never have this kind of discussion because there were, first of all, so few women to even have this discussion about. And second, you kind of understood that if you talked about it, you would be pushed out of the old boys network, which really controlled everything. So you really wouldn't be able to advance your career if you brought attention to these matters. And that's really why the work group was founded. There was an awful story, awful in its content, not awful in the fact that it was published. It's wonderful that it was published in the Star Ledger in December of 2019, I believe, that really detailed anonymously some of the horrible, horrible instances of sexual violence, sexual harassment, misogyny that women in New Jersey politics have faced over the course of many years. And very few women were able to go on the record and talk about it because everybody feared retaliation if they were to talk about it on the record. Senator Weinberg, who you've mentioned, is such a champion and has been for her entire 3 decades almost in the state legislature, called me and one other woman who has had a long-term relationship with her and said, we need to do something about this. We need to create a work group that really brings attention and focus to this matter. And we need to include not just women like us who've been around a very long time, but younger women who are the ones who are facing this at much higher rates because they're younger and they're not as established. And so that's what we did. We pulled together a wonderful group, a bipartisan group of women. Sabeen is a key member of that group, but that reflects really the breadth of the women working in New Jersey politics today, not just older white women who've traditionally been the women, to the extent that women have any power in New Jersey, have been traditionally the women who've had power, but women from a whole diverse geographic background, racial background, economic background, to really an experiential background, to really delve into not just some of these stories, and give people the opportunity to come to a safe space and talk about these stories, both publicly if they wanted to air them, and also anonymously and confidentially if they didn't want their names associated with it. But then to take our findings and produce some recommendations that could be turned into legislation and other policy solutions to these issues. I believe that what we've done is to be, obviously, I don't want to speak for both of us, but from my perspective, what we have done is something that's a very good start. It's resulted in some very powerful legislation that's going to help a lot of women and victims, as you said, not just women, of sexual violence and misogyny and harassment. But it's also not enough. And it must continue. And with Senator Weinberg's retirement from the legislature, it will continue, just with Senator Weinberg in a different capacity, obviously no longer as a sitting senator. But our work remains to be done. Our work is not done in the least. These issues still exist. They are by no means solved. And it's up to us and incumbent on us to ensure that the next generation of women who comes after us no longer has to deal with issues that we've had to deal with all these years.
And before we jump into what the recommendations of the group were, because again, I know that you heard hours and hours of testimony. You also had testimony submitted to you in writing, as you shared, for those who didn't want to come forward. And I was very struck, and I watched a couple of the Zooms, and I sat in on the one group that met in Fort Lee, and I was just struck by again, the person after person who came forward and shared their stories. And, I walked out of there thinking about how, we really at the YWCA had taken over the few years prior, had taken the position of really pushing women to run for office, especially, women that didn't look like me, women that weren't white, to run for office and to move forward and get themselves into seats and in positions where they could, be part of decision making. But as I listened to so many of the women tell their stories, I thought to myself, wow, we didn't really prepare them, for what they were going to come up against. And it was also because we weren't talking about what they were going to come up against, because that wasn't like, as you said, we know it was happening, but it just wasn't a public conversation until this group came together. So Sabeen, I'm just wondering, from the experience of hearing so many stories and then thinking about moving forward to get more women in the places and spaces that we need them, and diversity entrenched as well. How can we make that shift to support women to really fill those spaces that we want them in, and be able to do it in a way that they can be focused on what's in front of them that they're there to do, and not these issues that really are an impediment to them being able to move forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I mean, frankly, starting the conversation is step one to kind of having any catalyst for change. As Julie mentioned, these are issues that women have had to deal with, and now both also genders have had to deal with for years and years now. And there's all sorts of discrimination that comes in that, as an other minority based on your ethnicity, gender, etc., you're seen as, just kind of put your head down and do your work. And any of these instances might be isolated, but there's nothing that will change the system, so just kind of participate. And I think we're finally just seeing that enough pressures come to a head that now we have all generations really communicating with each other openly about their experiences and about having that opportunity and moment now to say enough is enough. We've had to deal with a lot for quite some time, and it's time to change it, and the only way to change it is with women. Luckily, there's a lot more women and different types of looking people on West State Street, and now in different governmental capacities and leadership roles. But as you said, we have to also prepare these individuals for what's to come when they do face diversity, because these issues aren't isolated and they might recur, but having some sort of accountability or mechanism in place where these individuals are heard and there's some sort of reportability and there's actual actions taking place, that will really cause long-term change. And as Julie also said earlier, this is just the start. This is the bare minimum of what we can do, but it's definitely a catalyst to what's to come. And that I'm looking forward to seeing.
And, just over the river, we've seen this, similar situation now play out, nationally in the national news with the governor of New York City. Can you speak a little bit about that case too? And I guess, for me, sometimes when you're watching something like that happen, people get so caught up in blaming the party, right, as opposed to the actions and the activities that happened. I think it's so important for us to make sure that we're keeping the conversation focused on that this happens in all parties, that this happens across the board, that it's not relegated, into one place or space.
Yeah, the Cuomo experience is actually very instructive, I think, for all of us, and very instructive on the New Jersey side of the river, as to what happened and why Andrew Cuomo was held accountable. And I've been in touch with some of the Cuomo survivors, but the stark difference as to why Andrew Cuomo was held accountable. And let's not forget, a year ago, Andrew Cuomo was the most popular politician in the nation. He had won re-election in New York by a landslide. He was running for a record third term. And he was kind of the rock star for a lot of Democrats, not just Democrats, for a lot of Republicans as well. Mm-hmm. Flash forward a year later, and Andrew Cuomo's kind of left office in disgrace. And you have to wonder why it was that he was held accountable, whereas other men have not been held accountable. Two reasons for that. One is Andrew Cuomo never asked anybody in his inner circle, as far as we know, to sign non-disclosure agreements, so that when Lindsay Boylan, the very first woman who came forward, she was able to do that without fear of being sued. She wrote a very heartfelt Medium post, presumably because the media itself refused to cover her story, so it was up to her. And that happens consistently, by the way. There's a lot of blame in the media to go around, where they just will not focus on these issues until it becomes a scandal. But they won't really work to expose these issues for a number of reasons that we can get into another time. But she wrote a Medium post and exposed what happened to Andrew Cuomo. What happened then is not in debate. Andrew Cuomo used the power of his office to go after her, release internal confidential information, personnel records about her, try to disparage her, try to discredit her, try to make her look like she was a liar. At that point, something that also really never happens, the Attorney General of New York stepped in to conduct a truly independent investigation. This was not an investigation that was conducted by Andrew Cuomo, allies of Andrew Cuomo, political flunkies of Andrew Cuomo. This was a woman, the Attorney General, Letitia James of New York, who came in and critically used subpoena power to try to get people to tell the truth under oath, so that people who perjured themselves or frankly just lied outright to the media about some of these Cuomo accusers understood that they could not lie to the Attorney General because she was placing them under oath. And if they lied to her, they'd be in legal jeopardy. And that's how Andrew Cuomo was held to account, because you had a report that came out based on factual information derived from people speaking under oath and conducted by an entity, in this case, the Attorney General, who was truly an independent entity and was not beholden to Andrew Cuomo in any way to try to tamp down these allegations or otherwise get him off the hook. Really conducted this without fear or favor. That's why Andrew Cuomo went down. And that's why you don't see other politicians going down in the same way. They use NDAs to silence women or prevent them from speaking publicly. They use internal investigations where the people who are conducting the investigations are financially beholden to the very entity that they're investigating. And they don't have the subpoena power or otherwise compel any kind of compelling ability to compel people to tell the truth without fear. And if you look at the Cuomo report, which I read, the Letitia James report about Cuomo, every single sentence of which I've read, there are people there who did not want to testify for a variety of reasons. They didn't want to ruin their careers. They didn't want to get involved. They were compelled to testify because they were subpoenaed. And until people are compelled to tell the truth, because there's penalties to not telling the truth, you'll never be able to get to the bottom of these kinds of situations. And we're letting way too many predators off the hook, and also allowing them to retaliate and put fear into the very people who should be protected in these situations.
Right. And even when, obviously, these are very high profile cases, but we know that this happens on a daily basis to survivors when their cases are not, pushed across the newspapers and the TV. And so just let me say, if anyone watching this, we know that the statistics are that we have many survivors that are likely watching this broadcast, and this can be a triggering conversation for you. And we are very sensitive and understanding to that. Please know that our 24-hour hotline, 201-487-2227, is available to you if you are feeling hurt because of this conversation. And, we just, these resources are here and do through today and make sure, again, that we're bringing attention to this very important issue. Again, because, I think in the last few years, we've seen so much in politics. I mean, we saw a Supreme Court justice, have these allegations. We had a former president, former recent president, right behind, our current president, who right prior, I should say, deal with this in the news every single day. But we didn't get, those two incidents to the point where we did with Governor Cuomo. So thank you for explaining some of the details about how, we were able to learn from that experience. So knowing that and the work that the work group has done, where are we now today in New Jersey around this issue? And what have been some of the findings, and what have been some of the lessons learned that are now becoming the basis for, legislation and protections put in place going forward, so that, our hope is that as the years go on, these are not the issues of focus for women as they're talking about, being in these roles.
Well, there's a few things that are exciting that's changing with New Jersey. And first, as early as I said, just having a conversation does change the political climate of what's going on. And also the fact that we are going through COVID right now. So there's really a period of reflection and kind of understanding what harassment looks like in isolated situations, I think has been helpful. We also, our work group was able to produce some really great legislation that is currently still under consideration by the legislature. And it really creates a independent engine for folks to complain to and really register any issues that they might have while participating in a campaign. And that's significant on its own, even if it hasn't gone all the way to get signature yet, because the bill really highlights an issue that's going on, especially during campaigns. And for New Jersey, we have our gubernatorial as well as our state Senate and General Assembly elections going on right now. So really having this broader conversation with hard pieces of legislation to kind of meet these goals really keeps up the accountability, and I think creates an environment of transparency. And I know that the next administration is also dedicated to making sure that a lot of these things remain intact. And although we will miss Loretta Weinberg at our helm, she will still be heavily involved because we have a lot to do still.
There's also one thing I want to mention that Senator Weinberg did pass into law, thanks to her, that really is critical. A few years ago, as a result of a lot of media around the use of Governor Murphy's of NDAs that Governor Murphy used in his campaign, Senator Weinberg proposed legislation that ultimately did get signed into law that would preclude the use of NDAs for toxic workplace issues. And that's incredibly important. New Jersey was the first state in the nation to do that. And what that means is that if you're sexually harassed or racially discriminated against, or there's gender discrimination or any kind of workplace misogyny, any kind of workplace toxicity, if you signed an NDA, if your boss made you sign an NDA, that NDA is no longer prospectively enforceable, which means that you are no longer mandated to stay silent about your treatment. It lets the sunshine in. And what it does is it puts predators on notice that they can't hide behind these silencing mechanisms that prevent survivors from coming forward and exposing their wrongdoing. It is legislation that has been possibly one of the most important workplace protections in history, in the history of labor law, at least in the last 100 years. And it is something that California just emulated. About 2 weeks ago, Governor Newsom in California signed legislation that mirrors New Jersey's. It's something that other states are taking a look at. It's something that my organization, Lift Our Voices, wants to take national to the Hill in a couple of months, if not in the next year. And that's due in large part to Senator Weinberg's very, very, very critical, almost transcendent vision to make it easier for survivors to come forward and to hold their predators accountable. It's incredibly important legislation, and New Jersey should be proud of itself for being the first state in the nation to do something like this.
Well, I appreciate that you putting a spotlight on that, and it's nice to see that New Jersey is at the forefront, of something so important. And we do hope that it becomes definitely a national effort, and the YWCA is here to support any work in that area. We try to give our viewers at YWTV action items that they can, after they watch one of our broadcasts, of how they can help support the issue that we're focused on lifting up. And you both mentioned some legislation now that is out there, and additional legislation to move forward. How can we help? How can those of us watching, what can we do to be able to support and not be part of this problem, but actually support revolutionizing the culture here?
Well, there's legislation that Sabeen mentioned, the bill numbers of which we can certainly send along to you, that was introduced in the Senate that creates a independent mechanism under the Election Law Enforcement Commission to ensure that if there's any kind of workplace toxicity complaints within political organizations, that there is an independent structure within the Election Law Enforcement Commission to investigate that. Typically, the way these things are investigated, if they're investigated at all, is by the very same organizations, political organizations that are under, that the complaints have been lodged against, which obviously is no investigation at all. It's a whitewash for the most part. So this would allow an independent mechanism, independent entity to investigate those complaints. That's very important because, as we learned in the Cuomo situation, among many other situations, you really need an independent body to investigate these kinds of complaints without fear or favor. The other, on the federal level, which I would strongly urge people to take a look at, it's legislation that's been introduced and will hopefully go to the Judiciary Committee in both the Senate and the House very soon, is legislation that would preclude mandatory arbitration agreements, forced arbitration agreements, in instances of sexual harassment and assault. And that would be probably the largest, if not one of the largest, labor law changes in the last 100 years, because what it means is that right now, if you're sexually harassed in an organization, 80% of American workers will be bound by forced arbitration by 2024. You're probably one of them, whether you know it or not. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that if you're sexually harassed, this goes into a secret chamber where an arbitrator, who's typically an older white man, adjudicates your case. There's no appeals process, and you have to live with whatever they come up with, and chances are you won't get any kind of satisfaction. Only about less than 10% of these cases are usually resolved on behalf of the complainant. And so we know that, again, this is one way that sexual harassment predators are protected. So this legislation would prevent forced arbitration for victims of sexual assault or harassment, and I strongly urge people to write to their member of Congress and ask them to support this very crucial legislation.
And just for reference, those bills in New Jersey, I had to pull up S3389 and A5354. And I think paying attention to bills like that and contacting your local lawmakers and letting them know that you support this bill, tracking it as it goes through committee, and making sure that it's an issue that is relevant to your represented official is really, really crucial. I think we often think about federal legislation as the albeit pit stop for everything. And really, it's a two-pronged process. We need our local, state, and federal politics and policies to really align for us to be protected. So engaging with that is really helpful, and engaging within your community too. Even participating in forums like this, for at least I know for younger women, has been really helpful and emboldening in making sure that you're not the only isolated one going through this. Finding the support and services, not only to create change, but also just to kind of get you through the day-to-day, is also critical for empowering yourself and ultimately then effectuating this policy change.
And so, to our viewers, we will put after this broadcast, we'll put some information in the comments here about this legislation, so that again you can follow up. You really, our viewers out there, again, as I always say, and we're right on the hub. We're actually voting right now too. But this is a key part. But the vote, it doesn't end with voting. It's an ongoing process. Of staying informed and making sure that whoever is in office, whether or not you cast your vote for them, if they represent you now, making sure that they are educated on your values and what you want to see happening, in our state, and of course nationally as well. So we will make sure we drop that information in here. Two quick things before we leave each other, and so much more I could ask, but one, Julie, I wanted to just give an opportunity for you to talk about Lift Our Voices. And for our viewers, we will put the link here to the website, and definitely an organization that you should be following on your social media channels. Can you speak a little bit about the work that your organization is doing around this area and so much more?
Sure. Thank you for asking. So this organization was created by me and Gretchen Carlson. Both of us worked at Fox News. Gretchen Carlson was the woman who sued Roger Ailes for sexual harassment and really helped kick off this iteration of the Me Too movement by standing up to somebody so powerful. After she and I settled our lawsuits, what we realized was that we'd heard from thousands of women like us who didn't have the same megaphone that we did because of where we had worked, or the same attention paid to these issues. And they were legitimately devastated because they had these same very similar stories as we did. I also sued Roger Ailes for sexual harassment, and then Fox News for retaliation. So many women do the same thing, but they're unable to tell their stories because they're bound by these silencing mechanisms. And the two that are most pernicious are non-disclosure agreements, which we talked about earlier, and the other is forced arbitration, which I just mentioned briefly. Really forces people into a secret chamber, and nobody knows. We had colleague after colleague that left the network, and we were told it was because the ratings weren't good. They weren't that, doing so well. It turned out they had actually complained about Bill O'Reilly or somebody else at the network sexually harassing them, were put into arbitration, never to be heard from again. And this is the way that careers are destroyed, because if you can imagine, if you can't talk about what happened to you when you apply for your next job and your next prospective employer says, well, why'd you leave the job where you worked for 10, 20, 30 years? And your response is, I really can't talk about that. I really can't tell you. Of course, it looks like you did something wrong. Whereas in fact, you did nothing wrong other than going to HR and saying, hey, I was sexually harassed by my boss or racially discriminated against by my boss. And I don't think that's right. And immediately you're slapped with these silencing mechanisms to prevent you from coming forward. This is how Harvey Weinstein was protected for all these years. This is how Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly were protected for all these years. Les Moonves at CBS, and countless other people. I will just mention that the people who are most affected by the silencing mechanisms are actually minimum wage workers, and no surprise, women and African American workers. People who are most disenfranchised in society are most disenfranchised in these cases as well. So since nobody else was really talking about these issues, Gretchen Carlson and I decided that we were going to launch a national organization called Lift Our Voices to address these issues and fight against them. And we've been at it for the last several years, and we'll keep at it until we eradicate them and make sure that women and people of color and members of the LGBTQ community and everybody else can work with the same kind of dignity that we're all entitled to, and not have to worry about these issues. And predators are not protected at the expense of survivors. So thank you for asking.
Yes, well, thank you for sharing. And again, for our viewers, please, we have the link here for you to learn more. And we do encourage you to follow Lift Our Voices on social media. And so as we're closing out this conversation and kind of opening the door for the next two in the series to come, I'd love for the two of you just to, speak to women who are considering running for office somewhere. Doesn't matter what level or layer. I mean, after hearing this conversation and so much that women had to endure, in these places, it might make them feel like maybe this isn't the right time. Again, as I shared, I really struggled with when I sat there hearing the stories that I'm not sure we prepared women well enough for what they walked into. And it really had me thinking differently about the conversations we have with women as we're encouraging them to get into these spaces. So what are some messages that, each of you would share just to leave them with as they're thinking and contemplating those choices?
I would certainly say now more than ever is the time to engage politically, whether it's running for office, but also remember there are a lot of supportive roles in leadership position that as a woman, it shouldn't just be the person in charge. It should be all of the supporters around that elected official. So chief of staffs or policy aides or speechwriters, fundraisers, all these key components to a political landscape will serve us all better if we start to see people in these positions of power that look like us. So now would be the time to be engaged. You're a lot more supported now than before. There are supporting mechanisms out there, as well as working groups, as well as women's groups. So support is there, but we definitely need to see the change within ourselves before we can demand overall change. So that would be great.
Yeah, and I would have just exactly right. And I would just add that if we're not at the table, policy will be made by men for men. And that's consistently been the case for decades. We can't afford to have that. We can't sit back and complain about the fact that men are creating policies for themselves if we're not willing to step up and break our way into the back room if we need to. I very often find myself one of the very few women on political campaigns sort of in the room where it happens. I don't want to be that person anymore. And the reason that I'm still here and many women that I started out with are not here is because they very rightly understood that there is a toxic work environment they no longer want to be a part of. So they leave. And what I would say is it has gotten much better over the last 25 years. There is a whole army of women standing behind you who are supportive of you, who will lift you up and prop you up and make sure that you are protected from what used to happen in the last 20, 30 years. Sabeen is absolutely right. Now is the time. We need more women in that back room making those decisions, speaking up on our behalf. Come join us because there are not as many of us as there need to be. And we are here to help you and guide you and be a resource to you every step of the way.
Well, we thank both of you and the entire work group for taking on this conversation and taking it from the back room and, people, whispering and suffering in silence, women being able to share in open forums, in virtual settings and, writing their stories, sharing their stories, and doing it knowing that there are other women standing next to you to support you. Again, folks, we encourage you to support the legislation. We have the information for you here in the comments now. It has magically appeared, as things do here at YWTV, because of our wonderful team. And so, please take a look at that and think about reaching out to your electeds and putting that through. Also reminding you that right now, all around, and I know this week the YWCA of Northern New Jersey is sponsoring with the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley a whole series of debates right here in Bergen County. They're happening all around the state. Learn about your candidates that are running right now, and then cast your votes in an informed way. But make sure, again, that you're putting people in office that reflect your values and what you want to see happening. And as we are getting ready for the next set of elections and to consider who will be sitting in future seats, think about that for yourself and others. To be moving into those directions. And again, thank you to all who have paved the way. Of course, Senator Weinberg and so many around her and others in different places and spaces that have created these opportunities for women like all of us, to be able to move forward. So with that, I also want to make sure, again, that you join us later in the week. We're having a conversation with Lauren Hirsch to talk about human trafficking and, of course, the recent very high-profile R. Kelly case. On Friday, we'll be talking about the USA Gymnastics case. And as I said, this is all part of our national effort of Week Without Violence. And in the midst of all this, just because it happened to fall this way, tomorrow we hope you join us for a special conversation that's focused on International Pronouns Day. Grateful to have Ebony Jackson with us from Montclair State University to be talking about what it all means with pronouns and why you should use them. And I know that it's something that we can all do and model and help support to create a more inclusive and safer environment. So please join us for that conversation tomorrow. And lots of other great things happening at YWCA Northern New Jersey from a programming perspective. And we have a link here for you to learn more. We hope you can join us for a virtual gala on November 10th. And we have a link for that for you as well. Julie and Sabeen, thank you again so much for the work that you've done and sharing some parts of it here. And we look forward to staying connected to you and staying, abreast of other ways that we can help support the work that you're doing.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.